Thank you for coming out this evening. We've got an extraordinary panel, and we're going to be talking about the Mueller investigation. The big suspense was whether we'd be talking about the Mueller report. And this morning, I'll have to say, I got this feed from the New York Times, and it was saying something about they were going to have their own panel. Actually, it looks less good than ours, on Thursday. And you can kind of call in, or, of course, here we're live. And I mistook it for the Mueller report had just been issued this morning. So I was in a bit of a panic, thinking that we might lose all of our panelists. But it didn't, and it hasn't yet. And maybe we'll talk about that. It's an extraordinary group of lawyers and folks who have kind of some first-hand knowledge here and some real experience to share with us. Let me quickly introduce our guests, and then we'll get right into the conversation. Of course, with us is Attorney General Eric Holder, the 82nd Attorney General of the United States. It's a great thrill to have you back again. Columbia College, Columbia Law School, a great friend back home. And one of the longest serving attorney generals in the country. So we're really proud and grateful that you're back with us. We also have Preet Bharara, who is also a graduate of Columbia Law School, class of '93, and so welcome home again. Preet Bharara was the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, downtown, and served from 2009 to, what was it, 2007? 2017, right.
Something happened.
Something
I don't know.
happened, right?
One day I was told not to come back to work. I don't.
Yeah. Fired, as it were, right? One of the
Yes, thanks for reminding me.
Badges of, I would say, one of the badges of honor, you know?
What does your Twitter account say? Something fired by Trump, that's what, by Putin?
Banned by Putin, fired by Trump.
There we go. There we go.
Right. And now a professor down at NYU Law School. So welcome up back home. Next, we also have Joyce Vance with us, who was the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, up in Birmingham from 2009 till 17 also, right?
2017. I was smart enough to not get fired.
Right. And we've actually worked together on some Alabama stuff in the past, and so it's a real thrill to have you here. And now you're a professor at the University of Alabama Law School, so that's terrific. And then we have Mimi Rocah, who was an assistant U.S. attorney here at the Southern District of New York, and so worked in part with Preet, and is for Preet. Right.
So did I.
And is now a professor at Pace University Law School, and also a commentator on it's MSNBC, right? Actually, it's MSNBC, CNN,
yes.
CNN, and MSNBC, right? And Matt Mueller, who worked with Eric Holder at the Department of Justice as Eric Holder's spokesman and chief responsible for public relations at the DOJ for many years, and is now a partner at a firm doing public relations and also commenting a lot on the Mueller investigation. All right, so let's get going. The first thing I'm going to ask is for each panelists to give us a little bit of an idea of what they think is the most important issue surrounding the Mueller investigation, the most important thing for us to be thinking about as we await the report. Eric, do you want to start?
Yeah, I guess I'd say that I have total confidence in Bob Mueller and the people that he has surrounded himself with. So I think the thing that I wonder about, worry about, is what's going to happen to the Mueller report, such that it is, and that's something I think we could talk about, what is it actually that they will produce? What happens when that gets sent to the Attorney General. What does the Attorney General do with that report? I think in terms of the investigative stuff, in terms of the formulation of the report, that's going to get done and be done, I think, fine. The question is what happens to it once it is done and submitted. So that's something I think we should talk about.
Will we see it? Will we see it? Will it go public? And right. Okay. Preet?
So there are a lot of important things, I think, going on with the Mueller investigation and the offshoot investigations, the ones that have been transferred to my former office and the DC U.S. Attorney's Office and the National Security Division. So I'll pick something that's a little bit offbeat, and it's what I worry about and what I think is very important is to think about how people are going to react in the country to whatever the Mueller report is. And lots of people, I think, presume to know or hope that it's going to be a devastating takedown of the president, and other people think it'll be a nothing burger. I think it could be either one of those things. I think it could be something in between. And the concern I have about the way we've talked about these issues and the way we've talked about criminal investigations in the era of lock her up and lock him up is that people are going to base their view and their opinion of the Mueller report, whatever the findings are, based on whether they're for Trump or against Trump, as opposed to whether or not the conclusions drawn and the facts laid out, if any, are well considered and supported by evidence and seem to be fair and seem to be fair-minded. And so I have a great concern that whatever happens, some portion of the country is going to hate Bob Mueller and another portion of the country is going to love Bob Mueller. And I don't know which side is going to be which, depending on whether the expectations are met or not met. And I think that's a very important thing for us to grapple with.
Joyce?
It was so much easier to talk about the Mueller investigation 6 months ago when it was really just the Mueller investigation. We had a special counsel. We knew he was investigating Russia and related sorts of issues. And as a country, we had a much easier time putting our arms around that notion. But now, as Preet says, excuse me, there are investigations in the Southern District of New York. We know about that because we've seen some of them in court. There are likely investigations going on in certainly the District of Columbia, maybe in Brooklyn in the Eastern District of New York. We know that the Attorney General in the state of New York has some pieces of it. And what we are seeing, I think, is something that's much larger than the special counsel's original ambit. And so I agree with Preet that there are many people who will, along whatever their political party lines are, either be exuberant or deeply disappointed when the Mueller report comes out. And it is important that as a country we think about this as more than just one investigation, because we have a president who is stress testing the rule of law, the notion that you can't get away with criminal conduct even if you're a president. It may be that the work that Bob Mueller has begun will be finished in a variety of very different places. And so what we have to, I think, do, and what I think it's wonderful that you all are doing by being here tonight, is to educate ourselves about the system, about how it works, and rather than buying into a result because it sort of hews to what our personal preference is, seeing what the law says and what the facts say, and understanding that that may not happen all in one moment when Bob Mueller releases his report, that it may be a process that takes years and ultimately culminates up on Capitol Hill.
Thanks, Joyce. Mimi.
So I don't want to say I agree with Preet, because then it'll seem like I really am just sucking up to my old boss. But I was going to say what Preet and Joyce have now said, which is I think the greatest concern that I have, and I think why you have so many former, prosecutors and agents also doing this, being talking heads on TV, is because we are concerned that people are going to see this result purely through political and partisan eyes, as opposed to what we all tried to do as prosecutors, which is not be political and not let political considerations influence us. And we talk about that every day to audiences now on TV, on podcasts, et cetera. And we say, well, this is, as a prosecutor, it is possible to have personal beliefs, but put them aside when you're doing a case and you're following the facts and following the law. And then to have this big case that is possibly, one of the most public-facing cases ever come out and have people see it only through a partisan lens is not only going to affect this moment in time, but I'm afraid it's going to affect how people see our Department of Justice for many years to come, and that's going to be really lasting damage. There are many ways in which I think the president is doing lasting damage, but that's going to be one of them. If people decide that our justice system is political and not capable of having people pursue it in apolitical ways.
Thanks, Mimi. Matt?
So I think one of the interesting things that we have learned over the past almost 2 years since Mueller has been at this is the reason I think you see so many people in the country kind of just put all their faith in Mueller, in some ways I would say misplaced faith, is they look at what the president does every day. They look at the way he tramples on the rule of law, the way he tramples on norms. They look at the way that Congress doesn't do anything to hold him in check. And there's this hunger for someone, anyone, to do something about it. And so Mueller has become this person that has kind of almost taken on this, messianic form in the minds of a lot of people, that he is going to be the person that he's going to be the one person that stands up and makes this all stop. And I think because as long as the investigation was going on, that gave a lot of people hope, because they thought at the end of this, somehow you would see the president, arrested and walked out of the White House in handcuffs. I think that's why you see so much debate over this question about can a sitting president be indicted. I think it's a completely academic question because the Justice Department has said no, but people argue about this question so much because they want to believe that if the political system is broken, there is some other savior at the end. And I think that what we're going to find out at the end of Mueller's investigation, no matter what his findings are, whether he thinks the president has committed a crime and he refers that to Congress, whether he thinks the president hasn't committed a crime, but there are all these other actions he's taken that maybe amount to misconduct and Congress has to look at them. I think what we're gonna find at the end of this is that while there's obviously a huge role for the Justice Department to play in policing presidential behavior, at the end of it, a lot of our other institutions have to step up too, and that means all of us as citizens have to step up. And so I have a little concern that at the end of this, it's kind of to Preet's point, if Bob Mueller doesn't walk out and hold a press conference and says, the president committed these crimes, he needs to be impeached, tomorrow there's this massive deflation because you have people who feel like the system is broken, he was their hope, they don't know what to do. And I think the thing I would say is we have to look to our other institutions and all of the rest of us to look for something other than just the Justice Department to fix what is, I think I would argue, and I know how the fellow panelists feel, I watch them all on TV, what they all feel is a massive problem in the country right now.
Mm-hmm. Preet, you want to jump in for a second?
I agree with everything that Matt said, and it's further to something I used to say when I was U.S. Attorney, and I've heard other people say, prosecutors, as powerful as they are and as self-absorbed as some of them you see on television are, they cannot solve any deep-seated social, economic, public safety, medical problem. And that includes all the things that are going wrong now with Donald Trump, whether it's the opioid crisis or corruption in Albany, which we did a lot of work on, or corruption in Washington. It's one tool. It's one thing that people can do. You can hold people with this blunt instrument that's the criminal law accountable so far as it goes. Separate question with respect to the president. But otherwise, generally thematically, people need to understand that you can't put prosecutors on a pedestal and think that if they lock a few people up, that's going to solve all the things that cause Donald Trump to be able to do the things that he does. You need society to pay attention. You need politicians to pay attention. You need the judiciary to do things. There's lots of other folks who need to be involved to solve the ailments that we have.
Okay. Mimi, you have a short comment, and then I'm going to ask one question to the panel.
Even in the past week, I would say, I've noticed a difference now in people replacing Mueller the savior with the SDNY the savior.
Well, that's okay.
The amount of questions that all of a sudden, have just ticked up of, what makes the Southern District so great? And I say, well, let me tell you, but no. But it's just an interesting, almost transference.
Right. Eric?
One thing I think that we need to gird ourselves for, and I think the points that you all raise are right. The hope that people will see this report as Joyce has said, and not through a political lens, not through a partisan lens, that's not going to happen. You know, I think the one thing that I think this president has successfully done is put us into, you know, respective camps. The comment that he made, I guess, Saturday or Sunday at CPAC, where he said all the stuff that they're looking at is bullshit, his word. That was an anticipation, I think, of, you know, a negative report. And I can't, unless there are tapes, videotapes, I mean, really compelling, unbelievably compelling evidence, I think his supporters will dismiss that which all of us would probably look at and say, well, this is, you know, this is pretty convincing evidence. I mean, we learned from Watergate. You know, Nixon, until the release of the tapes, you guys aren't old enough to remember this, until the release of the tapes, had a pretty substantial amount of support. And this was in spite of the fact that the case had essentially been proven. Now, the tapes were, you know, really conclusive. And even there, just before he resigned, he still had like 25% support in the country. Given that history, and given the inclination of this president, given his history, I think we should gird ourselves for a nation that is just going to look at this report in two different ways.
Right. Okay. So, since we're at Columbia and we believe in core knowledges, let's go back to the basics here and let's start from the beginning. The official document that appointed Robert Mueller as special counsel outlined the scope very specifically, and the scope was, quote, any links and or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the campaign of President Donald Trump, or Donald Trump, right? I mean, that wasn't the way it was phrased, but it would be any links and or coordination between the Russian government and the Trump campaign and Trump. And then also any matters that might arise directly from the investigation. Let's start with that first scope question first, or that issue. Without disclosing any private knowledge you might have, just as a purely kind of what's on the record, right? Do you think that there's any evidence or will be any evidence of a coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with Trump or Trump himself? Okay? Narrowly defined. Joyce?
Thanks. So, look, this is obviously the gorilla in the room, right? It's the question, and it's actually a two-part question. Because one question is, did somebody who worked on the campaign have contacts? And then the ultimate question is, did the president have contacts or participate in some way, either through a conspiracy or because he was giving orders? And we see pieces of this, but I think it's fair to say that we don't know the answer. We've seen this indictment that Mueller has brought with enormous detail. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but when I indicted conspiracies, even a speaking conspiracy, I did not give people the level of narrative that Mueller has given us in the indictment of 13 GRU officers, where he tells us precisely how they operated. And so the question is, and it seems like there are a couple of very pregnant paragraphs in that indictment where he comes awfully close to talking about American involvement but doesn't quite get there. Now we have the Roger Stone indictment, which maybe inches a little bit closer, and there have been some details, and I think back and forth, frankly, with the judge in that case about whether or not Stone actually was involved in sort of these kinds of operations. Manafort, there's been a little bit of back away from maybe his direct transfer of knowledge to Konstantin Kilimnik, who Mueller has identified as someone who worked with the Russians. So I would say we are on the precipice. We just don't know the answer yet.
Okay. On the precipice, don't know the answer yet, but I take it that means that barring new information that could be revealed in the report, the information that we have from the indictments, which are very specific and contain a lot of language that do, for instance, relate to other crimes, such as campaign financing, right? We have evidence of that, but there's no indication that there's any evidence that would go to coordination at this point. Is that fair? Preet?
Well, just further to what Joyce said, there's some evidence of that. I don't think there's evidence that goes to, what a core criminal charge would be. We know that there was what we believed that we know, because there have been allegations, not proven yet, that there was a chain of communication between someone who was a close confidant of Donald Trump, Roger Stone, and according to allegations made, chain of communication between him, Roger Stone, although he has denied it, and Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And we have other allegations that show that there was Russian hacking that took place with respect to emails that found their way into the possession of WikiLeaks. So you sort of have a chain. The question is, who knew what when? And part of the reason why you may not have enough evidence that there's a conspiracy that would be the more serious charge that goes to the core of what Bob Mueller's ambit was, of conspiracy to hack, conspiracy to actually do the thing that caused damage to the Hillary Clinton campaign. You don't have that. I haven't seen any of that. What you do have, what it looks like to me, is after the fact, after the hacking took place, whether or not people on the campaign participated in that hacking, that criminal act, which is a very serious thing, there was coordination, it seems, with respect to how that stuff that's already stolen, the thievery had already happened, how that's disseminated, and done so in a way that would inflict maximum damage. Like the timing of the various disclosures of those emails was done in a way that a lot of people think, and I think there's more reason to think so now because of the Roger Stone implications, that it was done in a way that only someone who understood the strategy of the Trump campaign and understood the ways in which you could hurt the Hillary Clinton campaign had to have been involved. That's coordination of a type, and depending on what the circumstances are, maybe there's some sort of crime there, but I think you can say that there's coordination.
Matt, you're...
Yeah, so I think it depends how you ask the question. I think if you ask it in a criminal context, the answer that both Preet and Joyce have given is exactly right. We haven't seen evidence of it yet. But if you ask it a different way, did Donald Trump know that the Russians wanted to help his campaign? Did he accept that help? And did he encourage that help? And the answer is yes. I think there's plenty of evidence that. There's the Trump Tower meeting where his son got an email offering help from the Russian government. They took the meeting, they accepted it. After the first set of hacks took place, Donald Trump encouraged the Russians to hack again. Or he wasn't joking. It's very clear he wasn't joking. After the second hack, he publicly talked about it all the time. So that's the answer to one question. If you ask the question on the other side, did the Russians know that Donald Trump welcomed their help, wanted their help, and if elected president, would deliver policy outcomes that benefited them? I think the answer is very clearly yes as well. So I think while the answer to whether there's a criminal conspiracy that can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt is uncertain and may never be yes,
Okay.
the plain facts, I think, are pretty clear.
Okay, so we haven't gotten to conspiracy yet in criminal law. We're still at homicide right now, right? Okay, but we are going to get to conspiracy. Conspiracy requires aiding and abetting, right? I mean, that's an element of a conspiracy charge. Y'all are the experts on this. Yes? No?
But not
Yeah?
exactly.
Go ahead.
They're really
Mimi.
two different crimes. I mean, if you're talking about aiding and abetting, that's one crime. If you're talking about, the conduct will overlap. Conspiracy can be defined a little bit differently, that if you know someone's undertaking an illegal act and you're aware of it and you do something in furtherance of it. Aiding and abetting, I think, actually requires a little bit more than conspiracy. I think it's easier to be put into a criminal conspiracy than to be found guilty of aiding and abetting.
Do conspiracies require agreement?
Yes.
But if you know about it and you further it...
How would you define agreement here?
Well, I think, if you take the facts the way that Matt laid them out, you are so close to, I think, being, if we weren't talking about the president and we were, I could see us sitting around at the U.S. Attorney's Office if we were talking about some other person on a similar set of facts, having the debate of, is he in the conspiracy? Is he not in the conspiracy? The agreement here would have to be implicit. Assuming there's no tape, there's no email, there's no text, there's no actual conversation of, hey, is it okay if we, help you out with this election? Yeah, sure. And in return, I'll help, relieve sanctions. I mean, you're probably not going to have that. So the agreement is going to be implicit. But prosecutors charge implicit agreements in conspiracies all the time. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, when I listen to Matt lay out the facts, which I agree with, I don't want to be the one to say I would charge it, but and maybe Preet would stop me.
So let me
I should have been a prosecutor.
Let me lay out the facts this way. You've got a president of the United States who's a New York commercial real estate guy, right? Who pushes all the limits on everything. Yeah.
That's enough.
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Okay, so you've got New York commercial real estate guy who pushes all the limits, who receives information that the Russians may be trying to hack, who makes statements, because he's a virtual reality TV guy, that he wants the Russians to hack. No, seriously. Is that
Do you want me to answer that non-question?
So with that, is that enough to have an implied agreement and a conspiracy?
Yeah, it depends on how much more you can elaborate on the facts. I think there is a distinction between having conversations and having an understanding about whether or not hacking is happening in real time and there being a meeting of the minds on that, and having an understanding about wanting to exploit the material that came into the possession of other people after the hacking. Now, with respect to that, based on the facts that Matt outlined very persuasively, I suppose there's some different kind of crime. It could be a conspiracy to commit some kind of campaign finance violation, because I think if you change the facts a little bit to the following, and you said, the Trump campaign and Trump maybe himself knew that there was damaging information and the hacking's already happened, so I think that's an important temporal distinction, and they have this stuff that's going to help his campaign and will hurt Hillary Clinton's campaign, and Michael Cohen went to them and said, we'll pay you, here's $1 million, could you please release these emails when I give you the signal when there's bad news on our end? I think most people would say that's a crime.
Well, that'd be clear.
Right.
That would be clear.
But the reason this is less clear is because they're not offering money. And the second, the other side of the quid pro quo is not exactly clear. Mimi was hypothesizing, and based on some things that have happened afterwards, a lot of people infer that Donald Trump must have had some kind of agreement, because he keeps doing all these things that Vladimir Putin would want him to do. But I think that's a little bit of a bridge too far without more information about whether or not there was an explicit meeting of the minds and an arrangement by which a thing of value, namely the dumping of these emails, was encouraged by the campaign in exchange for something I think that the campaign was going to do for the other side. Because sometimes criminal conspiracies are unprovable because everyone just understands what the other side wants to do. Not only is it explicit, they don't even have the kind of meeting of the minds that the criminal law may require, even though you see the results of it and it looks just that way.
Go ahead, Mimi.
Well, I mean, agree. I think we would need to actually, for it to be charged as a criminal conspiracy, ultimately you need some form of direct proof. But it's just to say that there's no criminal conspiracy, we have to assume that all these things that happened were coincidences. And prosecutors love to say, we don't believe in coincidences. And I mean, Matt listed some of them, but there are more. I mean, remember the day that Trump called out to, hey, Russia, if you're listening, according to, and this was very specific in the GRU indictment, Mueller pointed out on that day, for the first time, that's the language Mueller used, for the first time, the Russians hacked the Hillary Clinton's emails as opposed to just the DNC. On the day that Trump made that call to Russia, I mean, is that a coincidence? Was Russia going to do it anyway? Were they listening to Trump? Was he joking and they just happened to be listening? I mean, there's different ways to explain it. Again, I'm not saying enough, but there are these, and you go back to Trump back in 2015 said that we don't need sanctions. I mean, that's before this happened. You know, some people say that's was the beginning maybe of an agreement, that he was already stating we don't need sanctions. So there's just so many coincidences that need to be explained away if there wasn't a meeting of the minds, but that doesn't mean you can prove it.
Would we have expected an indictment of Trump Jr. or Kushner as a result of the kind of conversations and the meetings, et cetera? If we were, that obviously would have made the likelihood of a conspiracy charge much greater, right? Or actually, it would have kind of put the conspiracy on paper. Would we expect another kind of indictment before the report to kind of make that point before the report comes out? And if the report comes out without it, would we think it's less likely that there's going to be direct evidence of coordination? Preet?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's very difficult in all of these conversations that all of us have had many, many times in forums like this and on television and elsewhere to speculate. I just don't know. I feel that there are many times where we think something is true because of our experience handling a normal garden variety criminal case, you know, how people decide to flip, what kind of benefit they get from their cooperation. And I've found time and time again that I've been wrong because it's not ordinary. In some ways, you know, they're doing everything by the book. But this is an extraordinary investigation with extraordinary stakes and extraordinary subjects and targets. I tend to think that you're correct, but I'm not prepared to say that.
Eric?
You know, it's interesting because I think Preet's right. Speculation. We don't know. I mean, we certainly have heard certain things that I think we can accept as fact, and Matt lays out, you know, I think some very interesting facts. We don't know if that's it. I mean, is that all that Mueller has, or because of FISAs and all kinds of other things that they have access to that have not been publicly revealed, is there more that would actually bind all of these things together in a provable case? Whoever was saying that, you know, we're on the precipice, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that it's going to take an awful lot more to get us to the place where you could say that there is an indictable case, but that little bit more is really substantial stuff. I mean, it's going to have to be something, you know, significant. But does Bob Mueller have it? I just don't know.
Is there a duty to report to the FBI if you have this information? In other words, if you know that the Russians have hacked the DNC, Hillary Clinton's emails, and so you're knowledgeable about this, is there a duty to report? Would that be some kind of...
You mean, should the Trump campaign have reported something like that?
Yeah, did it have a duty to report to the FBI?
Well, yeah, they had some kind of a duty to do that. I guess didn't the Gore campaign do something like that, or I don't know, somebody? But you would expect that a reputable, upstanding, well-intentioned campaign would report to the authorities some kind of an entreaty from a foreign power. I think that goes without saying. I don't know if it's a duty. I don't think it's the absence of such a report. I don't think it's a crime.
Mimi?
I don't even know that you need to get to the question here about, is there a generalized duty to report? I mean, here the Trump campaign was specifically warned about, by the FBI, about Russians, you know, making attempts to infiltrate, basically. So I don't know that makes it a crime, but it certainly makes it a lot more suspicious, you know, what we call consciousness of guilt, of why they didn't then report every time there were these dozens of outreaches from Russians, and why they affirmatively eventually lied about it. That's a crime, and it reeks of consciousness of guilt.
But there's an odd criminal genius aspect to this on the part of Donald Trump, because we're talking about whether or not there was a duty to inform the FBI and a duty to do various things, and I agree with what's been said so far. And there's been a discussion about the kinds of things that Trump did, and did it amount to criminal conduct, much of what he did, maybe it's genius, maybe it's not, was open and notorious in front of tens of thousands of people. So, he this past weekend at the CPAC conference talked about how that statement he made about Russians, please, disclose the emails, was a joke, and Matt's quite correct. There's other interviews that he's given that make it clear that he wasn't making a joke, but he was still doing it publicly. And I think if you kept everything else the same, and you changed the facts as follows, you just take every one of those crazy public statements, like what he said to Lester Holt about Russia being on his brain, or what he said at that rally saying, please disclose the emails, and instead, it was a private communique, transferred from Michael Cohen to Roger Stone to some other person, and the New York Times had a scoop one day and said, these private communications happened. Everyone will be looking at this very differently. I don't know that as a legal matter, it makes a lot of difference. And then there's a second way in which Trump is sort of ironically a criminal genius, and that is he's surrounded himself by liars who are terrible liars and who are kind of scummy. And then one by one, they get picked off by someone else, and they try to flip. And then Donald Trump can legitimately, incredibly say, they're scummy and they're liars, undermining their ability to bring evidence against him. And so, that's all.
Okay.
But that point I think is really an interesting one, because I think, and it's in some ways very important. I mean, the fact you kind of logically look at Trump when he says Russia, if you're listening to me, you think to yourself, well, he had to be kidding, right? I mean, you couldn't be actually involved in a criminal conspiracy. This could not be a serious way in which he was communicating with the Russian government, because he's doing it on national television. And so when he says, I was kidding, that has in some ways the ring of truth, except then you see him talking to Katie Tur and other things. But so when he gets to CPAC and says, well, they don't understand, I was being sarcastic, I was just fooling around, you kind of go, yeah, who else, unless you're this kind of criminal genius, who else would do something like that? I mean, to do these open and notorious kinds of things.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's pretty stunning. It's pretty stunning. We haven't seen it before, that in this way. And there are these other contexts in which Trump will say certain things that seem like they don't make sense, but that they're actually talking to a constituency directly, in a way. I mean, I've been thinking about it in another context, not in this kind of was he speaking to the Russians, but some of the things he says about racism can only be understood from a far right, extreme right, alt right perspective. So when he claims that a reporter is being racist for asking him about whether claiming nationalism is racist in itself, I think when he says that's a racist question, a lot of us would just kind of like not understand what he's saying, because we don't understand that actually calling that a racist question is a foundational move of the alt-right, right, to turn diversity, multiculturalism, or anything into kind of form of racism. And so it's almost here as well. There's a way in which, and some people talk about it as dog whistling in that context, but it's very similar here. It's the possibility of actually intentionally communicating, but in a way that is not heard by everyone, but where there is an understanding going on. Matt?
Yeah, I think this was one of the more interesting things from the Michael Cohen hearing, when Michael Cohen was asked, did Donald Trump tell you to lie to Congress?
Right.
And he said,
that's not how it works.
That's not how he communicates. That's not how he talks to you. He just says there was nothing to do with Russia. He goes out and says it, and then you know what you're supposed to do. The same is true about all the way he communicates. It's why that he makes the Russia comment in the way he does. When you look at it, you could see that it does seem kind of sarcastic. He says things in a way where he still has some deniability. It's like if you think about his Charlottesville statement where he says, they're good people on both sides. He would say, well, I'm not saying Nazis are good people. I was saying there were some people there protesting the monuments. He always tries the way he communicates is a way that it sends a very clear message. It sends the message he wants to deliver to the people he wants to hear it. But he protects himself a little bit to come back and say, well, that's not what I meant. you're taking this too far, and how dare you say that's what I meant? Of course I would never say that. Of course I would never encourage the Russians. Of course I wouldn't support Nazis, when of course that's exactly what he was doing.
Right. But of course, that's what makes it extraordinarily difficult, for instance, or would make it extraordinarily difficult, I think, to prove even implied agreement, right? I mean, that would be where the difficulties would arise. Okay, so, all right, so we've talked a lot about links or coordination, which was the actual kind of, heart of the scope, defining the scope of the investigation. But then, of course, any other matters that arose and may arise directly from the investigation, and a few matters have arisen, including Michael Cohen, including the Trump Tower deal, et cetera, the Moscow Trump Tower deal. So of all of those, let's say, ancillary pieces of possible criminality, which is the worst, would you say? Which one would have the most likelihood of being the greatest problem for President Trump? Do you want to start us off, Joyce?
There are so many, it's so hard to choose at this point. I think it's very interesting, before talking about the specifics, to note that under Mueller's original grant of jurisdiction from Rod Rosenstein, he could have hung on to all of this, right? It says that he can investigate the Russia stuff, but also that he can investigate anything else that arises. And he has made a very deliberate decision, I would assume for political/credibility reasons, to put those other cases into the hands of other prosecutors. I find it interesting, that Matt is now making this point that Mueller is not some sort of a white knight or a savior, because I made that point on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, and you sent me a picture of some candles in your houses that were like St. Mueller candles.
I've seen the light.
They're great. The reality, though, is that Mueller is not, I think, a savior, and that he is very well aware of that. And so he has parceled, maybe for resource reasons, maybe for prudential reasons, these cases out. I bet everybody has got a favorite investigation. It is really so hard to choose. It's like choosing from among your children, I think, at this point. But the investigation around the inauguration looks like it's something that really has legs. Multiple jurisdictions have issued subpoenas. There's the possibility that donations were improperly taken from foreigners, either using straw people or some other kind of mechanism, and that would be a clear violation of law. And then there's this ongoing feature of Trump Inc., which is this constant need to make a buck out of absolutely everything they do. And we maybe see that playing out with the inaugural funds as well. So I think that that's a very interesting investigation that will continue moving forward, even if, as rumored, Mueller is about to deliver a final report.
Okay. And what about in terms of in terms of the indictments that have already come out? Preet.
I have one that I'm going to mention, but I was thinking about this as people were talking about how Mueller has, unloaded cases and sent them. I would have loved to have served as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, where Washington was sending us some of their best cases. Doesn't typically happen. So the one thing that it seems that is on the record most clearly that links Donald Trump to some criminal conduct is the campaign finance violation on the eve of the election that a human being named Michael Cohen has already pled guilty to. Now, that doesn't mean that other people are necessarily guilty of the crime, and you can no longer use the fact that someone pled guilty to a crime against someone else, and you have to be careful about how you use that evidence. But a person has pled guilty to a crime. It's not hypothetical. The judge has accepted that guilty plea, and in connection with the guilty plea, he has said, as everyone knows, I did this thing in coordination with and at the direction of individual one, who's the president. We have not seen an indictment of the president. We can speculate as to the reasons for that. Maybe it is sometimes the case that you can only prove your case against one of the co-conspirators, even if you believe the other person is implicated in it. Or it could be that there's the Department of Justice policy against indicting and the stakes are too high, and there's a difference between accepting a guilty plea from someone in connection with other crimes that they're pleading guilty to, and they're prepared to do it. There's a difference between that and going to trial against some other human being who may have participated in the conspiracy, so there can be a gap there that may not make sense to lay people. But that sometimes happens. But we keep hearing more evidence with respect to the cover-up that went on in connection with that campaign finance violation. starkly brought into sharp relief by Michael Cohen's testimony last week about standing in the Oval Office with the President of the United States, making clear that even though he had ripped off a lot of people and doesn't pay everyone off, whether it's bakers or construction companies or whatever, he was going to make sure that he paid back through this odd mechanism of a phantom retainer agreement. He was going to make 11 payments by check to his lawyer, who common sense tells you could not possibly, almost not possibly, have decided on his own, based on a home equity loan that he took out, pay $130,000 that was to benefit his client in a very serious way and to benefit him with respect to the election without consulting with him at all. So there's direct evidence. You have the fact of a guilty plea. You have the subterfuge. You have the fact, if you can prove it by someone, with evidence beyond what Michael Cohen said, that Donald Trump told Michael Cohen to lie to a reporter about the timing of Donald Trump's own knowledge of that payment before the election. You have a lot of stuff going on there that suggests that if it were a garden variety potential subject or target, not the President of the United States, that he's in real legal jeopardy of being charged for it.
Mimi?
And on the campaign finance crime, I mean, the evidence on that, I think is, I mean, if we're talking about what's the best case so far, I mean, the evidence on that one so far, at least public-facing evidence, is the most developed. Because remember, we also have that recording, which I think Giuliani actually leaked, where Trump and Cohen are talking about not the Stormy Daniels payment, but the Karen McDougal payment ahead of time. So while it's not the same one, if you were doing a trial, you could probably get that in as 404B evidence. So that, that's pretty good evidence that Cohen wasn't just off doing this on his own. And then you have, you would need to corroborate Cohen, but you have Cohen under oath twice now saying, that Trump directed him to do this and then directed him to lie about it. And then you have Trump lying about it, which again goes to this consciousness of guilt. So I think the evidence, and we don't even know what else the Southern District got in their search. I mean, Trump had a visceral reaction the day of that search warrant. And my guess is it's because he knew there was probably some stuff in Cohen's office that was going to be bad for him. Maybe more recordings, maybe documents, we don't know. But here's the problem. I think Trump and his surrogates have done such a good job already of just for lack of a better word, poo-pooing that crime, minimizing it to the point that even if it's chargeable, and even if you take out the issue for the moment of is a president chargeable, it's not that big of a deal. And I feel like that's the way people are reacting, because we really, as to that crime, have a lot of public-facing evidence already, and I don't even think we know all of it. And yet, it's kind of been met with a shrug. And not by everyone, probably not many of the people in the room, but the people who I guess would need to vote for impeachment and, et cetera. So that's, again, my concern is this is a crime that I think with this amount of evidence, you probably are, again, very close to being able to charge someone if they weren't the president, but people don't, it doesn't seem to have the impact.
Right. Okay, so we got a couple of issues on the table right here. One, and I want to get to many of them, all of them I'd like to. One issue is, if it's not the coordination, but it's one of these crimes that come out as a result of the investigation. If it's not the coordination or a cover-up over the coordination, which could be another way of getting at the coordination, but it's one of these, then how do the American people react, right? And that you were getting at that, Mimi. I mean, do the American people then say, okay, well, whatever, okay, so he's a crook, so there was a campaign finance violation, but we're not going to impeach him because of that. They didn't find what they were looking for. They found this other little thing, just campaign violation, right?
Everyone does it.
Yeah, right. So that's one issue. The other issue, of course, is he indictable? You just said he was, I think, publicly, right? So what's the answer to that? Is a sitting president indictable?
I think he should be.
I didn't say it should. I said is.
Well, you've got this Justice Department, OLC, Office of Legal Counsel opinion that says he or she is not. I don't think that Bob Mueller or Bill Barr. Yeah, wrong. Yeah, Bob was the tormentor, right? Bill Barr. I don't think either of them are likely to go against that DOJ regulation. I've read both of the opinions. I read the second one as recently as about a week and a half or so ago. I don't think that the opinion, I remember reading them when I was AG. I just had some time one day or something. I remember my assistant, Annie, I asked her, go get me the opinion. So I looked at him and thought, I didn't think these were that great. And was just something to do.
You didn't decide to change them or anything? You didn't decide, like...
No, there was no president I had to consider doing anything with.
Couldn't imagine one in the future?
No. But if you look at the opinions, and especially that second one, it's really all about if you indict the president, you will in essence I'm really boiling this down, you will in essence paralyze the executive branch. You will immobilize him because he's really got to focus on his defense and all that. Impeachment would also be, I think, a paralyzing thing. The founders seem to think that you could impeach a president. The paralyzing component, I think, is not dealt with in the opinion, given the 25th Amendment, so where the president could, temporarily leave the office and, deal with his defense. Vice president could be acting president. They deal with a little bit in the opinion, but it's really kind of almost in an offhand way. And the result could be that you could have a president who could conspire with a foreign power, get himself placed into office, have a Congress, a Senate that was reluctant to convict or would not convict, and have that person serve as president. That seems to me to be something that's inconsistent with the notion that no one is above the law and is just not good for the system. And I don't think that the arguments that are in that opinion are particularly weighty.
Matt, you were talking about this earlier. There's no likelihood that the DOJ would move away from this position. New Attorney General is not going to move away from it. So is this kind of case closed?
I think this Attorney General is not likely to move away with it. If you look at Bill Barr's views on executive power, they are on the extremely aggressive side of the spectrum. And so I think, given that, the likelihood of him overturning, what are now two OLC opinions over a period of 4 decades, seems to me pretty unlikely. But I do think the reason we continue to debate it is you look at Congress, and the Michael Cohen hearing, I thought one of the takeaways for me, I used to think, this gets to a question that you asked a minute ago, I used to think that I had faith that if there was a piece of, just a smoking gun piece of evidence that emerged, that the president on the phone with Vladimir Putin, that some percentage of his base would move away from him, sufficient to sustain conviction in the Senate. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. One of the things, if you watch that Cohen hearing, the Republicans on the committee, they didn't even give the kind of head nod that you see politicians often give, the kind of, well, these are serious questions that you're raising, Mr. Cohen. It would obviously be of grave concern if what you said is true. There was none of that. And there's been none of that almost at all lately from Republicans. So I think that's why we keep coming back to this question. But given the Attorney General's views, it seems very unlikely to me.
Joyce, do you want in?
So as much as it pains me, I'm going to disagree with y'all and say that I actually like the policy to some extent that the OLC memo set up against indicting a president, even though it's very painful in this situation because there's a prudential concern that if you set up a situation where you can indict this president, who many people think needs to be indicted, then what keeps you from indicting the next president down the road and the one after that? And does that become the conversation in American politics where we indict presidents as soon as they're elected, sort of as a matter of course, and we have a total breakdown in the system? One can make the argument that the expectation is that if the evidence is so strong that it supports an indictment and that the American people would be behind that indictment, because we all seem to be acknowledging without really coming out and saying it explicitly that this is not a garden variety case because there has to be more support for it than a garden variety case. So if the evidence is really that strong, then a Congress, even this Congress, should be willing to impeach, much like Eric points out, that with Nixon, the support level was really high until suddenly it wasn't. And maybe for prudential reasons, it's better for us to let the political process resolve these issues than the legal one. Maybe not a popular opinion, but just out of that prudential concern of what comes next, it's where I find myself.
Eric, and then Preet.
Well, one thing I'd say, in terms of the prudential concerns, you have to remember that you'd have an attorney general who would be running a Justice Department who would be appointed by that president. And for that attorney general to make the determination or to give the go-ahead to the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, for instance, to go ahead and indict the president who appointed the two of us, that would be a pretty extraordinary thing. And so I'm not as concerned about the systemic negatives or potential negatives that you talk about. I think that we can rest assured that people at the Justice Department, career folks within the department, U.S. attorneys would only do that where they really thought they had good proof and a good case.
I hate to be cynical, but not all attorney generals are you. We have a recent example, right? We had a Matt Whitaker, and who knows what he would do, a future Matt Whitaker.
Well, that's what I mean, though. But if Matt Whitaker said, go ahead and indict Donald Trump,
that you'd be certain, right?
Right.
But it could also work the other way. You could just have an unscrupulous attorney general who, for whatever unpredictable reason, might go there, or a crazy U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York who might take things into his own hands.
It makes me think that Benjamin Netanyahu is thinking right now, why don't I have an OLC opinion that might help me? My view is a little bit in between some of the views that have been stated, and I've said this before a number of times. I don't have a strong view on the underlying policy and the legal analysis. I'm prepared to believe it's shoddy reasoning. I'm also prepared to believe it's a reasonable policy going forward, but it is the policy, and it exists. And not only do I think it's a virtual impossibility, with one caveat that I mentioned at the end, it's a virtual impossibility that Robert Mueller will indict given the prevailing policy that he's subject to. I think it's a good thing that he will not indict based on the prevailing policy, even if you hate the policy, and maybe even the policy should change. Because when you're talking about something as high stakes as indicting the sitting president of the United States, whether or not you think he shouldn't be above the law, that is about the biggest thing that any prosecutor can do in the world. And it's an unelected person. And going back to the first point that I made at the outset, I'm very worried about how people are going to react to the work that's completed by Robert Mueller. And for there to be some kind of support and even a hope of bipartisan support, which may be overly optimistic, of his work and his decisions and his conclusions, I don't think he can take positions that are the minority view or that go against the prevailing wisdom at the department, even if you think that policy is very terrible. I just think about what it would look like in the world if notwithstanding that policy, Robert Mueller chose to indict. Now, my caveat to that is, because, as you know in law school, if you change the facts a little bit, then maybe your outcome is a little bit different. For a campaign finance violation, which you can say is a serious crime, but there's a similar sort of crime along these lines that John Edwards was not convicted of, and the department chose not the same in every way, but it's sort of similar. You might decide that even in that circumstance, you wouldn't want to indict the president, notwithstanding the policy. But if you change the facts to something much more outlandish, and you found out that Donald Trump, and again, I'm just making this up, I have no personal knowledge of this, if Donald Trump, strangled someone to death on the White House property, suppose that happened, would we be talking about the policy? Would we be waiting for impeachment? I think in that circumstance, and you had smoking gun proof, you had a video of Donald Trump committing, or let's say he did it on Fifth Avenue. Maybe he wouldn't lose any votes. But I think it moves the needle a little bit. And there's obviously a range of things between a campaign finance violation and a homicide. And I think that probably comes into play a little bit as well.
Yeah. Grading, right? Students, grading. Few grades of difference between homicide and campaign financing. Okay, all right. I've got a few punctual questions I'd really like some answers to. So, putting aside the campaign financing, What's the second biggest violation that we've got here? Is it the Moscow Trump Tower, possibly? How is that a crime, or what would be the criminal activity there? And so, yeah, Matt, you want to? What's the second? And if it's not the Moscow Trump Tower, tell
So
me a little bit
I have
about
a pet one that I'll come back to after the Moscow, because Joyce got to give her pet one. The theories I've heard on the Moscow Trump Tower meeting is, one, that's where they entered into the conspiracy that then played itself out over the following months, the hacking and the release of emails. The other is that it would be a violation of campaign finance rules to accept a thing of value from a foreign national. That is in the campaign finance law. It's actually in the campaign finance law to solicit a thing of value. I think you could have an argument over whether opposition research, which they didn't end up getting, by the way, is actually a thing of value. But that's one of the theories of the criminal activity at that meeting. My pet potential crime I keep coming back to is the pardons, the dangling of pardons by the president. Publicly, over and over, and reportedly in conversations between his lawyer, John Dowd, and lawyers for Mike Flynn and Paul Manafort, and then just recently between Rudy Giuliani and a lawyer for Michael Cohen. And I keep thinking about this because I go back to Bill Barr's testimony and the memo he wrote before his confirmation hearing, where he takes this extremely expansive view of presidential power, where in his view, the president exercising his power, even for a corrupt purpose, say firing the FBI director because he wanted to end the investigation, even if he had said, I'm firing you because I want this investigation ended, that's not a crime, it's not obstruction of justice. But even under Bill Barr's view, offering a pardon or granting a pardon in exchange for a witness's silence would be a crime. And so there are a lot of facts you have to establish to get there, but those conversations that have been reported, I've always had a hard time understanding how Mueller would let that go without pursuing it. And I have a hard time understanding how SDNY would let go the conversation between Rudy Giuliani and Michael Cohen's lawyer that pertains to their investigation.
So this would be an obstruction of justice charge,
Right.
for trying to corrupt a witness
Exactly.
through the pardon process. Okay, all right. Mimi?
I was going to go back to the Trump Moscow Tower.
Sure.
Which I think there's so many Trump towers, it's hard
Right.
to keep straight. But I think you were also asking about the one that Trump wants to have built in Moscow.
Right.
Reportedly.
Right.
Well, he's now admitted it, right? Well, they're all important. I mean, they're all Trump towers.
And that he claimed was not moving
Right, he
forward
lied
during
about
the
it.
campaign. Right.
And he, according to Cohen, basically got him to lie about it without saying so explicitly to Congress. So there's a lot there. And again, it's a fact that we know Mueller wanted us to know about, right? Because it came out in Cohen's plea, the lies about it, and it didn't have to. I mean, Mueller didn't have to have him plead to anything, and he didn't have to have this sort of somewhat detailed for a plea allocution about a false statement. I think that the Trump Tower is one of those ones that is potentially the Trump Tower Moscow. That's one of those smoking guns that's out there that we don't know about, because it isn't a separate crime. If it's relevant to a bigger conspiracy here, to a quid pro quo of, I want this tower, we'll give you your tower, we'll get you elected, you give us the sanctions relief. I mean, to me, that's how it would fit in, and whether that can all be linked together, I mean, there's a lot of breadcrumbs suggesting that they are connected. There are conversations that we've heard where they talk about, Manafort is reported, and again, this is not a fact, this is things reported, so I don't know for sure, but to have discussed with Kalimnik after giving him poll data, sanctions relief. So and then you have Cohen still pursuing this Trump Tower deal at the same time that the Russians are helping to get Trump elected, which is indisputable. So there are the outlines of, I think, a significant, serious quid pro quo type of, which could be charged in a number of different ways, including a bribery. Even though Trump's not yet an elected official, at the time, you'd have to charge it as a conspiracy and go back to when he's not. I mean, there's technical requirements under the statute. I actually wrote an article about this, of how those could be met. But I think the idea of the Trump Tower, it's either just he didn't want people to know he was pursuing this business deal and it's shady but not criminal, or in my mind, it's part of a much bigger piece, of a grand conspiracy.
Okay, all right. So we've got a number of other ancillary possibilities, some of which might actually be tied into the main issue of coordination, as you suggest. With regard to all of the other investigations that are taking place at the SDNY, EDNY, et cetera, tell us how that works exactly in the sense of you'd have to get approval from headquarters, right, for those investigations, and to move them forward, you'd need approval from the AG, wouldn't you, Eric?
No, I don't think, not necessarily. I mean, I think in this case, given the magnitude of what is being investigated, I would assume that there's a fair amount of coordination between the various U.S. attorneys' offices and Main Justice. But there's no technical requirement that, Preet couldn't open an investigation against, same facts, a New York City assemblyman or something like that. If it was something that was going to be particularly newsworthy, we would hope that we would get an urgent report or some kind of indication from the Southern District that, you can expect an indictment tomorrow. Didn't always happen.
Not always.
But no, I don't think there's no requirement. But again, given the magnitude of this case, I think that there's all kinds of coordination going on.
Right. Okay. Coordination going on with Department of Justice, and then how does the coordination work with the Mueller investigation or the folks in Mueller's office? In all likelihood.
Well, I mean, again, this is speculation, but it would seem to me that Mueller is obviously was talking to the Deputy Attorney General. Now I guess he's talking to the Attorney General and keeping him abreast of what's going on. The Attorney General is talking to the U.S. attorneys. But
the U.S. attorneys are not talking to Mueller?
That's actually an interesting question. I'd be interested to hear what my other panelists think there. If I were Bob Mueller, I'd want to minimize my conversations with the U.S. attorney, direct conversations with the U.S. attorneys.
So my thought is that there's obviously a lot of coordination going on, and it depends on the thing that's being looked at. So, for example, again, it's all speculation also, but assuming I'm the U.S. attorney at this moment, if I've got my team and one of them, one member of the team is looking exclusively at something having to do with the taxi medallions on the part of Michael Cohen. It's a local thing. It has nothing to do with the president. It has nothing to do with Russia. It's this side criminal activity that he was engaged in. I don't know how much you're going to be telling the special counsel about that, other than at the end of the day, if there's going to be an action taken, you might want to give them a heads up. And part of the reason for that is the Mueller team also was investigating, even after the handoff of Michael Cohen, they clearly thought that Michael Cohen committed a crime insofar as he lied to Congress. So, necessarily you're going to want to make sure that you're not stepping on each other and you're not taking positions that are going to hurt your case or the other office's case. That said, they're independent of each other in a sense, and you saw evidence of that when on the same day, I think a little bit of evidence of that, when you saw on the same day that the Mueller office, the special counsel's office, and the Southern District of New York, my former office, both put in sentencing submissions with respect to what they thought of the cooperation afforded thus far by Michael Cohen, what should happen. And the tone of them was very different. And their assessments of Michael Cohen's helpfulness and credibility and everything else was quite different. I would imagine, my guess would be, that they shared their views in advance and they respectfully decided to have, they weren't competing because they're different courts. So I guess the bottom line is that there's some coordination, and probably not every jot and tittle is cleared, but there has to be some given the circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Joyce, U.S. Attorney.
I think that Preet is absolutely right, and I think where there might have to be more coordination would be on technical issues like turning over grand jury evidence. Right there, there's going to be normal interaction between prosecutors like you would in any situation where a case moves for whatever reason from one jurisdiction to another. But I think Eric is absolutely correct when he says it would be in Mueller's best interest to not have too much cross-pollination and to try to maintain his own little fiefdom, even though in many ways he's operating a lot like a 94th U.S. attorney here, right? Like an additional U.S. attorney. So we speculate about it. We don't know for certain. One thing that we do know is that when Mueller put his team together, he took a really extraordinarily experienced attorney out of the Solicitor General's office, the lawyer who had more experience in front of the Supreme Court on criminal cases than really any other lawyer in the department. And I see that sort of, maybe because I'm an appellate lawyer, I see those sort of fingerprints behind this, making sure that everything that's done is very careful, that there's nothing, if there should be any kind of criminal prosecution down the road, nothing that could impair those prosecutions on appeal. So being very careful about your lanes would be a part of that.
Just one more quick thing.
Yep, go ahead.
The other bit of coordination that's more complicated because it's outside the department. I mean, sometimes within the department it's difficult because different people have different things that they're looking at. But the Mueller folks also have to coordinate with the State Attorney General in New York and, according to reports, with the Manhattan DA's office, which, according to reports again, is preparing charges against Paul Manafort. That's a little different and more complicated because you don't have one, umbrella under which you both operate, so that can be a trickier thing to handle.
Okay. Cover-ups. So we've talked a little bit about the obstruction of justice, possibility of obstruction of justice. Obviously, the cover-up was a big issue on the central claim of covering up possible coordination, firing of FBI Director Comey, and all of the questions surrounding that. What's your sense of where that's gone or going? Could we imagine? I mean, you've all been prosecutors, and you all know the importance of kind of if you don't get the main charge, you go for the cover-up, right? Where are we in that process? What do we think we're going to see in terms of, the firing of the FBI director? Is that gonna be an important piece here? What do you think? Mimi?
So, I think no one piece alone would be enough for obstruction, but as we've already talked about, so many acts, and there are more, right? The dangling of the pardons, the firing of Comey because of Russia, the firing of Sessions, presumably because he wouldn't recuse and control the Russia investigation, the statements to Matt Whitaker of, this is a little bit separate, but you could probably put it in a pattern of, why aren't you doing more to control that out-of-control Southern District? And then the witness intimidation, which, again, we were talking about how blatant Trump is. I mean, he does it by tweet. Michael Cohen, watch out. Your father better watch out. I mean, I said at the time, and I still believe, if I were doing an organized crime case and a defendant said that to one of my cooperating witnesses in the bathroom during a break, your dad better watch out, I would be going to Preet to say, can I charge that as attempted witness tampering? Because, and let's say it was recorded, so it wasn't a proof problem. But to me, that's an implied threat, trying to get someone not to testify. And Trump has done that, again, over tweet, and even in press conferences where he talks favorably about the witnesses who are not cooperating, Manafort, and unfavorably and berating about the ones who are. I mean, it's so blatant that I think people have a hard time processing it as witness intimidation or obstruction. But if you put it in a secret email that's been discovered, I think most prosecutors would qualify it as that. So I think it's there on the obstruction. If you take it all together, it's a pattern. I don't know, one, whether it will get charged for all of the reasons we've been discussing, and two, whether that will, again, be enough for the public to sway opinion.
Other than the firing, the pardons, what other
The statements to Matt
elements?
Whitaker, trying to control the Southern District, the
Okay.
statements Flynn, let
Flynn.
Flynn go. Can you see your way to let Flynn go?
Okay.
The statements over Twitter and publicly about two witnesses, those who are cooperating and those who are not.
And then Trump
Joyce?
Tower, right? The shifting stories about why the Trump
Right.
Tower meeting
Right.
took place.
Trying to fire the AG, trying to fire the special counsel. In all those cases, they weren't executed because his staff refused to do it, but he wanted to fire them over the investigation.
But he would have in his defense on all those, he's the president, he asserts he has the power to do it. He wanted the staff to do it. They said, no, he still could have done it. He could have picked up the phone and fired those people. So he does have points in his defense.
Okay, two more areas before we open it up for questions. Eric, you had talked about the question of whether the report will be public or not. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And then I also want to talk a little bit about how this is going to affect House investigation and House oversight. We just saw a huge production of subpoenas and requests for information. So, first, on the publicness of the document, where do we think that's headed? What do you think?
Well, I think Barr makes a good point in the sense that the Justice Department doesn't reveal evidence about people who are not indicted. You get a pros memo or a declination memo. You look at that and, you speak through an indictment. You don't put on the public record that which you don't charge in court. In fact, the regulations that were put in place when I was the Deputy Attorney General. And we crafted these regulations out of a concern that we wanted people to act as the 94th U.S. Attorney, as opposed to the way independent counsels operated under that statute, where they were mandated to publish a report of their work, whether they brought an indictment or not. The putative defendant had the ability to file a 2-page, 3-page, whatever, rejoinder to that, but no one ever looked at that. They just looked at all the stuff that was put in the report. And we thought that was inconsistent with DOJ practice. And so we said, all right, we'll have them file a report with the Attorney General. My thought always is, though, that the Attorney General has a wide amount of discretion as to what the AG does with that report. And again, given the fact we're talking about the President of the United States here, you take out grand jury material, you take out material that might reveal sources and methods, national security things. And beyond that, I think you want to make as much of that report, or whatever it is that Bob submits to the Justice Department, you want to make as much of that public as is possible. And to the extent that Barr thinks that he can shield, or he can, through his view of executive power, that this is stuff that need not be shared, I think Congress has the ability to subpoena the material, to invite, in the first instance, subpoena Bob Mueller in the second, to come up and testify about his work. And I'd be interested to see
Open?
Well, some of it would probably not be in an open setting. I think part of it, some of it would have to go to the intelligence community, the intelligence committee. But substantial parts of it, I think, probably could be done in a public setting.
Mm-hmm. Matt?
So this issue about public disclosure of the report is where I think the OLC opinion around indicting a president becomes really interesting, because the rule has always been indict or shut up. Well, what happens when you can't indict someone based on your own policy? The logic of that OLC opinion is that basically the Justice Department is not the arbiter of presidential behavior by a sitting president. Congress is. Well, for Congress to be able to do its job, they have to have all the evidence of potential criminality. And so I think this OLC opinion that the president and his attorneys have used as a shield for the last 2 years is now really a sword for Congress to demand not just the report. The report is one thing, but if it's true, as DOJ says, that it's up to Congress to decide whether the president has not necessarily broken the law is one standard, but committed high crimes or misdemeanors, then they need to have all of the underlying evidence as well as the report. And there's not a good reason for the Justice Department to say no, both because of the logic of that report and another thing flipping on its head, the precedent that has been set over the last few years, both in the Clinton investigation, where Republicans on the Hill demanded that all of the underlying evidence be turned over to Congress, and it was within 3 months, even though it was in the middle of a presidential campaign. And the last 2 years, where Republicans have demanded all of the evidence about the Russia probe that they thought was helpful to them be turned over, and the president has insisted it be turned over. And so in the middle of an ongoing investigation, you've seen DOJ turn over something like 800,000 pages of material. All of those precedents now make it, I think, very hard for DOJ to say no. They might say no, but I think it makes it much more likely that when Congress takes them to court, that Congress prevails.
So the big question, of course, is would it then end up in the courts? And how do we think that our new United States Supreme Court would rule in its majority? You want to take that one, Aaron?
Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine that the court, given, I think, the excellent way in which Matt has laid it out, that the Supreme Court would ultimately say, this material need not be shared with Congress, assuming there's a subpoena or something that they're in the process of litigating. I don't know what privilege would the Justice Department cite?
So what if the argument is it can only be shared with Congress under seal behind closed doors?
I'm not sure I see that. I mean, I think the Congress would say that, I mean, there have been cases where, we had Fast and Furious, where they talked about just using for their oversight responsibilities that they had to have access to certain materials. Now, if they're saying that we need access to these materials in order for us to potentially conduct impeachment proceedings, that I think is an even stronger basis for Congress to say we should have access to these materials. And I think at the end of the day, I don't know if it's a unanimous decision. I don't know what the breakdown would be, but I think the Supreme Court would probably side with Congress.
Preet? There's a pragmatic point here, too, and a political point, separate and apart from what a court might say. There's one of three possibilities, I guess, and these are variables that I think help to determine what will ultimately become public or not. Either the report is going to be devastating to the president, in which case I don't see how you hide it, because it looks terrible for that to be withheld from the public and can do you more harm than good, or it's going to be pretty good for the president, in which case Bill Barr is going to put a bow around it and want it to become public, or it's going to be a mixed bag. And when it's a mixed bag, this president has had the ability to say, as we've discussed before, to say basically it exonerates him, and he has enough support among enough people to be able to say, look, they didn't find collusion, they found some of these other things. And I just think the idea, long before we get to the court, of trying to prevent Congress from seeing this information, especially in light of the circumstances and the precedents that Matt laid out, is hard for me to imagine. As a pragmatic political matter, and then you have, the possible issue of people who have access to the information, who may find it necessary to reveal that information in an inappropriate way. I just don't see, especially if it's devastating or it's exonerating in some way, it doesn't make its way to the public.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the final issue is how does it affect the House investigation that's going on now, or that seems to be kind of ramping up? Any thoughts on that?
Well, it was interesting because in the last panel that we did, I was talking to those two former members of Congress, and I was saying that Congress should be moving, not waiting on the Mueller report. And I remember they were saying, you need to staff up and they'll get going. And I was thinking, yeah, come on, you do. Well, okay. They've staffed up and now they've got things going out there. Now, I actually think in some ways, I'm not sure I would have dropped 80 letters or whatever they did in one day. I think, doing it in a more sequential way, I don't know, a subject matter or something like that, would not play into what I think Trump's going to be able to say, which is this is a fishing expedition. Look at this. They got, 80 entities that they're trying to get information from. But I think the congressional, given the responsibilities, the duties that Congress has, they need to be doing what it is that they are doing, even if I disagree with maybe what their techniques are. I think they need to be doing what they are doing, talking to the prosecutors, to the Justice Department to the extent possible, so that you're not stepping on an investigation, coming up with an Oliver North situation where somebody gets immunized and that affects, a prosecution. But Congress has an independent responsibility. Prosecutors are looking to decide whether or not there's a criminal case.
the concern that Congress has is broader than that. High crimes and misdemeanors, and however that is defined.
And not just high crimes and misdemeanors and impeachment, but also just oversight, right? I mean, just lying and whatnot, right? Joyce?
A really important question here that Congress has never addressed is how vulnerable are our elections and what are we going to do to fix them? So I'm delighted to see that Congress has ramped up and is looking at impeachment-related issues. It's hard to look at these request letters in it as anything other than the beginning of impeachment hearings. But I'm still very interested in seeing a Congress that takes its responsibility to address election vulnerability seriously.
Terrific. Okay, so let's open it up to questions. There is a microphone. Giselle has a microphone over there on one side and another one on the other side. So don't be bashful. We have a question up front here. Hold on, let me make sure you get the microphone.
Okay.
Thanks.
The House Intel Committee just hired a prosecutor with experience fighting the Russian mob to lead the Trump investigation. That combined with Cohen's testimony, I'm wondering how you feel this impacts the Mueller investigation, if at all.
So Mimi and I worked with Dan Goldman. He was a Southern District of New York organized crime prosecutor, also did securities work. I wouldn't necessarily read too much into the fact that he had a background in Russian organized crime. I think what's more important is that he's an excellent...
Just coincidence.
I think you should note that he's an excellent prosecutor. He's a dogged investigator, and Mimi worked with him for many years side by side, and I'll let her speak about that as well. And he's looked for a professional from outside of the committee to do stuff that's, I think, incredibly important. It does not hurt that he has an understanding of organized crime, and particularly Eurasian crime. But I think a lot of people could have fit that role who maybe didn't necessarily have that particular background from years earlier. But I think it's a good sign that he's hiring a pro.
Mimi?
I think Dan is a great choice. I mean, he is, as I said today on Twitter, he's someone who's going to be aggressive, and I don't mean that in a bad way, without, I think, being reckless. He's got integrity. I mean, all the things that people want in a prosecutor, Dan has. I think that, he has also experience in Italian organized crime. So you could read it, with this administration, either one is relevant. But yeah, I'm not sure he was hired for that reason as much as that he's a seasoned, skilled investigator with, the chops to prove it.
Okay, who else? We've got a question right there, Giselle, right where you are, and then one over here.
Great. Many thanks to our distinguished panelists for coming here tonight. I think one of the key differences between investigating the president and any other person is that the AG reports to the president, right? And so, in theory, the president could order the AG or the acting AG to share details of the investigation with him, or even in some cases, if we had someone like Matt Whitaker, the acting AG might, voluntarily share information about the ongoing investigation with the president. And so how concerned should we be that the president's access to these ongoing details would compromise any findings in the end?
What do you think, Matt?
I'm not so concerned about it now that Bill Barr is there. I think Bill Barr is actually a real pro. He's someone who understands the department's traditional independence, is a much stronger character than Jeff Sessions was, and isn't just kind of a political toady like Matt Whitaker was. But it does get to the point, one of the things that we've gotten so used to over the last 2 years, the idea of a president calling up the attorney general and asking for asking for anything about an investigation into anybody, let alone himself or his campaign, is nuts. It's crazy. It is the kind of thing that never happened in previous administrations. The firewall between DOJ and the White House with respect to criminal investigations was, it was solid. There was no breach of it at all. No one on either side contemplated breaching it. And the stuff that happens, and I will say the president has at times succeeded in getting DOJ. Rosenstein has gone in and talked to him about the investigation. I think Rod's a professional guy and hasn't done anything to compromise it, but he's talked with the president about the investigation in a way that I think is completely inappropriate. I think there are a lot of reasons why he did it, but the president has succeeded in pushing the norm. I mean, we talk a lot about norms. We haven't tonight, but there are rules and regulations and norms. He has pushed the norms far, far beyond what they were previously, and potentially established a new norm, I think.
And I think that's a point that really people have to understand. The notion that a president would ask the Justice Department about an ongoing criminal investigation that didn't involve national security. I mean, there might be, if there's a national security case, you might want to have some kind of interaction. But a criminal case, as Matt says, the wall is as high as it can be, and there may be times when we within the Justice Department would make a determination that for some reason we maybe needed to share information about an indictment that was going to happen the next day or something along those lines. But sharing information about an ongoing criminal investigation, that's something that simply doesn't happen between the Justice Department and the White House.
One more point on that.
Yeah.
It's not only because it's bad for the case and it's bad for the person who's receiving the call, and the reason I share Matt's optimism is that I think Bill Barr is smart enough to know it's bad for the president. The President of the United States called me almost 2 years ago to the day. I didn't return the call. 20 hours later, I was asked for my resignation. I don't know if those two things are connected, but I don't think they're completely unconnected. And part of the reason I didn't return the president's phone call after deliberating about it with my deputy and calling Jeff Sessions, chief of staff, was not only for my own protection, should there be some dispute about what he talked about with me and if he was going to bring up an enforcement matter, but also for his protection. So I think that's an important point too.
Okay. We've got one question here.
I actually have two short questions. The first
Okay.
one, I don't know if you guys know the answer to this, but will the Mueller report ultimately be subject to the Freedom of Information Act? And the second question I have is that, you talked about the New York Attorney General has investigations as well going on. Are they subject to the Department of Justice regulations against indicting a sitting president as well?
Great, thanks. Either one?
Well, the answer to the second one, I think, is no. I mean, the New York Attorney General? No? Go, if you're listening to me, no, I mean,
Okay, on the FOIA question?
Yeah, on the FOIA, I mean, I think it depends what form the memo takes. If it's a declination memo, those typically aren't available through FOIA. But I think Congress, I think to some extent is a little bit of a question that will be moot because Congress, which has a much stronger claim for access to those documents, will be asking for them first and subpoenaing it. If it's not released, subpoenaing it and going to court over it before a Freedom of Information Act had a chance to be heard.
And do you know what the usual exception is for a declination memo under FOIA? Like what it is particularly? Is it privacy or?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
I think it's privacy, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
That would make sense.
Okay. All right. We've got a question on that side, and then we'll come back over here.
So, after this investigation, do you think that the investigation has revealed any deficiencies in the criminal law itself? Anything salient, whether it relates to campaign finance laws or procedure or just DOJ practice that you think moving forward can be amended, and how would you amend it?
What do you think? Let's see.
Yeah, no, I don't know that there's deficiencies in the criminal law, and people would ask me all the time when there were certain kinds of cases that the public thought should be brought. Should we give you more tools? Should we lower the mens rea sense? Should we lower the level of intent and the mental state that you have to have? Should we make it easier for you to be able to prove crimes? And almost in every instance, I said no, because federal prosecutors have a lot of authority. They have a lot of power. I think there's a better argument that in many respects, they have too much power. So I don't know that you want to give more. You want to change the criminal laws in ways that would have made it easier to charge anyone, including the president, other than this issue we've been talking about with respect to the OLC memorandum and the indictability of the president. I do think that there are a lot of deficiencies with respect to what are norms as opposed to what are codified laws. And among those are how the pardon power can be exercised. Among those are what the contacts policy is between the Department of Justice and how much transparency there is about and requirement of reporting to the Congress and to the public about what contacts happen between a president or someone in the White House and someone inappropriate in the Justice Department, what the ethical obligations are of a president to divest, whether or not they should release their tax, all sorts of things that the president is trampling on. And Matt pointed to me because one of the things I've been doing since I left office was we have this task force on democracy that I co-chair with Governor Christie Todd Whitman, who used to be the governor of New Jersey and the former EPA administrator under Bush, literally for this purpose, to talk about what kinds of things we might consider doing in either the next, this Congress or after Trump leaves office to prevent these kinds of abuses of power that are unfortunate and bad and terrible, but are lawful. Because as Matt says, he's pushing the envelope on norms really, really, really hard. And this happens after, other administrations too. We talk about nepotism. That's another thing I think that we need to revisit. And it is true that John Kennedy, and it seems miraculous in today's world, that you could have somebody who appointed his brother as the Attorney General of the United States, when now people get voted down as Attorney General by lots of members of Congress, like Alberto Gonzales did, got lots of nay votes because he was friends with the president. But you know what we did? Even though I think by most accounts in the 60s, John F. Kennedy was a revered former president, assassinated. And John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy was a very admired, and I admired Attorney General. It worked out that way. It ended up being okay. Not everyone agrees, but it ended up being okay. But then on a bipartisan basis, people decided, you know what, we can't have that again. That's ridiculous. And I think we have a number of those things that we need to be considering going forward.
Thanks. So right here in the front row.
Thank you for being here. My question is in regards to what I believe Preet mentioned earlier about the criminal genius or the idiot savant. We're coming from a Nixonian period where the notion that when the president does it, it's not illegal, to a point where when the president does it in a public square, it's not illegal. Is there a way for us as a society to fine-tune or maybe determine a framework for how to prosecute or at least understand the legality or illegality of saying something in public, on TV, or on a stage somewhere, even though it's cloaked in sarcasm, where it is defined as an illegal act or not? It's a very black and white question that deals with something that's very gray.
Yeah. How do we deal with this problem of kind of the
Do you know how we deal with it? We don't deal with it through the criminal law. And what people should be really angry about is not necessarily that there's a failing of criminal process or criminal statutes or a particular guideline that's sitting in a vault somewhere at the Office of Legal Counsel. It should be at how supine Congress has been when they see things that we have to debate. Is it a crime or is it not? The fact that we're debating all sorts of crazy conduct that is hypocritical, that is deceptive, that is horrible, and maybe it's a crime, maybe it's not, maybe it's indictable, maybe it's not, but I think the founders contemplated that there would be some other mechanism. I'm not even talking about impeachment, that a president who engaged in this activity where reasonable people who are schooled in the law have to wonder, is it indictable or not? That person would lose enough political support and would be checked by even members of his own party that we wouldn't have to worry about the 25th Amendment or impeachment or indictment. So I think that's a better solution going forward than changing the laws.
Joyce, you were nodding your head too.
Yeah, I agree with that in every way. There's this concept that prosecutors sometimes talk about, awful but lawful, right? There are things that people do that we all condemn. They don't necessarily violate the criminal law, but as a society, we are the people who elected Donald Trump after we saw him criticize Gold Star parents, after we saw him make fun of a disabled reporter. And at every juncture where as a society we could have stepped up, that just didn't happen. I think it's convenient to blame that on the Republican Party that chose to nominate him, but perhaps the truth is a little bit broader. So are you going to fix that for us?
Yeah, I'm right on it.
All right, on this side over here, I saw a hand. No, was it? There's one over here. Let's try and take 2 more questions, and then maybe we'll have wrap-up thoughts.
I'm wondering the extent to which we should be worried, should one of these cases go up to the Supreme Court, that 2 of the justices have been appointed by a potentially illegitimate president, and perhaps one of them owes the president a favor for helping him through the confirmation process.
Right. So, I mean, it's been a big issue with Brett Kavanaugh. I mean, in part, it was one of the reasons that there was a lot of opposition to Justice Kavanaugh was, in fact, the positions that we expected he would take in a situation like this, right?
Yeah, but I'm going to be a little optimistic here. I mean, I think that, given the Merrick Garland situation, the question of legitimacy is one that I think we should actually, we should talk about, and we should be talking about even things like, expanding the number of people who serve on the Supreme Court. If there is a Democratic president and a Congress that might be willing to do that. But now they're on the court. Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, they have life tenure, which I think is also wrong. Going to be 18 years, but they've got life tenure, and the president can't do anything to them at this point. I'm not sure I would have voted to confirm Kavanaugh, Gorsuch for that matter, but I think that they will act in a way that I may disagree with their opinions, but I don't think they'll act in a way that is pro-Trump because they feel they owe him something or there's been some kind of corrupt deal that has been struck.
But the issue is not just whether they would think they would owe him something. It was what their views were as kind of, it's prior to the selection. In other words, why they were chosen. And with Kavanaugh, I mean, part of the reason why he was chosen was a certain deference to executive power, right?
Yeah, but you look at his writings, and he talks about you can glean from him this notion of deference, but we're talking about something really fundamentally different here. Would he feel? I mean, Trump, I suppose, in trying to look at all the people he could have put on the court, probably in the back of his criminal genius mind or whatever, maybe he's thinking this is a person who ultimately, if the ultimate question is put to him, this is a person who will lean my way. He's going to appoint people certainly different than Bill Clinton would appoint, than Barack Obama would have appointed. So I don't see that there's a basis to conclude that we're going to get something corrupt out of these justices.
I hope so. Let's see. Okay, one last question here in the middle, and then we'll wrap it up with any final thoughts.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for being here. So going back to this question of what happens if we don't indict, I'm curious about your thoughts for the rule of law and what we're saying about this. And is there someone who is above the law? My second follow-up question to that is, Preet, you mentioned a sort of system of checks and balances that should be taking place, either moral courage or another set of institutions that is kind of checking these powers. And as undergrad students at Columbia, what do you recommend to this next generation?
Wow, now those are 2 great questions. I think they kind of set us up for final remarks, actually. So do you want to start, Preet?
Yeah, so with respect to the second question, I guess my answer to the first and second questions are sort of related to each other. What's interesting to me in this time, it's also part of the wrap-up, is people are really concerned about what's going on. People feel alarmed at what's going on. And part of the reason they're alarmed is because they see these bad things happening, and they see these norms being trampled, and they see the rule of law being undermined, and they see the institutions that used to be respected are being disrespected, whether you're talking about law enforcement or you're talking about the judiciary or you're talking about the media. And it's all happening in a way that's very upsetting. But the second reason that I think it's upsetting to people is that thoughtful folks, and maybe this doesn't apply to the folks in the room who are lawyers or studying the law, thoughtful citizens who don't understand how the legal system works, don't understand how indictments work, don't understand what the OLC is, it gives them a greater sense of agitation and frustration because they think it's bad and they don't know quite how bad it is because they don't know how it's supposed to work. And so for the first time, you're having this great civic engagement and education that's happening. And in our circles, we sort of joke and we think it's a little bit funny that for the first time ever, you could have a panel of former Department of Justice officials, and the moderator can go CNN, MSNBC, CNN, because there's so many of people like us on the air. I think that's a good thing, and I think the fact I have a podcast that you should listen to, and I have a book coming out in 2 weeks which you should buy. But one of the reasons there's a market for that, and I find this inspiring, there's a market for that because so many people want to learn, whether they go to law school or not. They want to learn about how the law works. They want to learn about how the law is supposed to work. So your question on what the young folks should do, you should help to educate people. You should figure out ways to explain to your lay friends, which I find myself doing all the time. Here's how this works. Here's why you should respect the special counsel. Here's what separation of powers means. Here's why we should consider these norms should be codified into stronger laws. And then what I say to all law students, which is another thing I'm very concerned about. So you see government and you think, wow, I don't want to work in this administration because I don't agree with what they're doing. And I don't want to go to the Civil Rights Division. And I may not want to go to the Southern District of New York or the Eastern District of New York. I think that's a terrible thing to think. I think if you care about your country and you care about your community, this is exactly the time for good, idealistic young people who may be graduating from law school or any other vocational school or at all to think about ways to serve your community and serve your country. And it's only, I think, through the contributions of people who are coming up that we can make the country better. I think that's very important.
Thanks, Preet. Joyce, final thoughts?
I like your rule of law question. I think it's a smart question. And one of the issues when we think about rule of law is, I know we each have in our own minds an idea of what that means, right? I'm not sure that there's a universal definition that exists. There are some very sophisticated ones, some basic ones. Maybe at bottom we're talking about a set of rules that are clear, rules that are fairly applied, and then this notion that you raise of whether anyone is above those laws, which is something that up until the Trump administration, I don't think we seriously brought into question. And it would be really great to answer your question by saying, oh no, you don't need to worry. There's still no one who's above the law because a president could be indicted after he leaves office, or a president could be held accountable on Capitol Hill for these crimes. Increasingly, those answers feel less satisfactory, and I think it goes back to comments that both Matt and Preet have made about norm busting and the need to establish new norms, perhaps to enshrine some of those norms in law so that we don't have to reach a point again where we question the applicability of the rule of law to everyone. It's an uncomfortable place, it's an unsettling place. I wish that there was an easy answer that, was something like, don't worry because, but that's just not where I think we are at this point.
Thank you, Joyce. Mimi?
So, I saw somewhere someone said something like, I can't wait to get back to the time where I don't have to think about my president every single day. And when I saw it, I laughed and I thought, oh God, yes, it's exhausting. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that's actually the right goal. And this is sort of to Preet's point, but a little bit different, that right now, I think many of us feel like we're in a time of crisis. We're thinking about really big issues. Can a president be indicted? Was there a foreign power that attacked us and somebody here conspired with them? And these are huge, important issues. But what's come out of that is that you have people focused more on their government, on their elected officials, on their justice system. I mean, none of us expected to be on TV talking about this because there was not a demand for it. And I think all of us, have felt the need to speak out about this rule of law, this Department of Justice that we all knew was this very special, unique place that was largely free of politics. And we want people to understand that that's the way it can be, even if it isn't feeling that way necessarily at the moment. And so I think what comes out of this is that when we're not in a time of crisis, if people can stay engaged and thinking about these things, that's a good thing. My 10-year-old daughter knows more about civics right now than I probably knew in college or in high school, certainly, because it's just everywhere. And it's not just because I talk about it all the time. Her friends at school, everybody talks about it. And ultimately, that may be the one really good thing that comes out of this.
Thanks, Mimi. Matt?
My thoughts are similar to Mimi's and Preet's. I think, the next 2 years, and maybe beyond that, are really going to be a battle for what this country is and what this country is all about. Trump is going to leave at some point, hopefully in 2 years, but it might be in 6 years. But I think there's going to be a fight over that. And then there's going to be a fight over whether Trumpism leaves with him or whether it survives. I don't know that there's going to be another figure that comes after him that has the same mix of kind of celebrity and shamelessness and TV ability that he has, but he has tapped into something that others are going to try to follow. There are going to be other politicians that try to tap into nationalism. There are going to be other politicians who don't care about norms and realize that they don't have to behave the way that politicians always have. And I think it is incumbent for every one of us who cares very much about the rule of law and cares about what kind of country we are, to be in the middle of that fight and be in the middle of fighting for what we want this country to be. And I would say, especially to young people and students who are thinking about what to do when you leave, I think Preet's point is right. Joining the government is one thing to do. I think going and working on a political campaign is something to do. You could follow the example of a very famous, accomplished law student who became a community organizer. But over the next few years, I think sitting on the sidelines, if you care about this country and you really don't like the direction that it's been headed, really isn't an option.
Thank you. Eric?
Well, first let me just thank you, Bernard, and this great panel for coming to Columbia. I think this has been, great. And I think to the extent that we have faith or expectations in our government, it's because we've had people like this who have served in it. I don't want to be an alarmist or express things in a way that would cause people, to get agitated. But I actually think that the fate of our nation, I think, is really kind of hanging in the balance. How do we deal with this president with regard to this issue? Will he be held accountable? Now, we have to wait and see what the proof is going to be. My ultimate guess is that you're going to have impeachment at a minimum. This is a pretty amazing thing for me to say. At a minimum, we're going to have impeachable offenses, and there's going to be the need for him to be held accountable. And if our political institutions do not do that, if the decision is made not to indict, and if the decision is made, let's say, to impeach but not convict, and the information is such that veteran prosecutors might look at it and say that you have a criminal case here. If this were a criminal case, you could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and yet a Senate does not convict. That will say an awful lot about this country. And it seems to me that a check on that potential result are people like you. And I think we tend to underestimate the power that we have as ordinary citizens. You saw it the day after the inauguration when women marched all over this country. You saw it, I guess, 18 months ago, 2 years ago, when attempts were made to roll back the Affordable Care Act, and citizens went to the offices of their congressmen, the offices of their senators, and really kind of pushed back and had an impact. And I think that we have to stay involved. This is not enough to simply think that, we haven't seen these great prosecutors, these great defenders of the rule of law before. This crisis will end one way or the other, but that doesn't mean that our concern about our government, our society, the way, or the rule of law should subside. It's not enough to think, as Mimi was saying, somebody says, well, I don't have to think about my president every day. Well, maybe you don't think about the president every day, but you need to be thinking about what kind of society do we have? How can we make it better? And the reality for me is that, this Trump thing that we have discussed today, the Mueller report and Russia, obstruction of justice, is only a part of the things that we ought to be concerned about when it comes to this president. There have been environmental regulations. There have been attempts to attack the ability of people to cast a ballot. There's a whole range of things that should be of concern to us, and they should activate us and try to make sure that, once Trump is gone, and he will be gone at some point. He will be gone. Matt's a good point, is a good one, though. Trumpism, I suspect, is going to live with us for, beyond the time that he is president. And for people who care about this nation, who care about the more diverse nation that we are fated to become, that we have to stay involved. It is not enough simply to be concerned now and unconcerned when he leaves. I think that, in fact, that's almost the silver lining here, that Trump has awakened in this nation a civic consciousness, a civic desire to be involved, and I hope that that will be one of the things that lasts beyond this president. So, and especially all of you young people, you young college students, young lawyers, I would urge you also to think about serving at least a part of your career in government. I was inspired by John Kennedy, who talked about the worth of government service. Since 1980 or so, when President Reagan gives that speech, the problem is government, there has been, I think, a diminution of in the eyes of too many people of the value of government and of government service. But if people like you, who are idealistic, well-intentioned, committed to the rule of law, don't take those positions, they will be filled by people less principled, less committed to the rule of law. So I would urge all of you young people to think about serving sometime in government, and for everybody to commit to be involved in making this nation better and all that it can be.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric Holder. Thank you, panelists, for a terrific conversation. Really good. And thank you for coming out this evening.